Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer and it's time to continue my How Did They Do That series, where I answer questions from you, the viewers, about how classic games achieved their graphical tricks. If you've previously submitted a question in the comments of my videos, maybe it'll be answered here. Even if you didn't, maybe someone else posted a question you've always wondered about. As we go, why not try to guess the technique before I reveal the answer? Let's get right into it. To start with, we're heading to the Nintendo Entertainment System with this question from Leo Staley, who says that Faxanadu does something that should be impossible. On the very first screen and several places elsewhere, there are background pillars that you can walk behind. This shouldn't be possible because the NES only has one background layer. Can I explain how they did this? Sure, let's go behind the scenes and check it out. Yeah, sorry, the bad puns are back. So this is Faxanadu. If you haven't heard of it, it's a kind of adventure RPG hybrid that's cut from the same cloth as Zelda 2. In fact, it released later in the same year, and it's actually quite good. It's reasonably long for a game from this time, but luckily we only need to play for a few minutes before we can see what the question is asking about. In this location, and a number of other locations throughout the game, the player and also enemies can walk behind parts of the background, like these pillars, but the NES, or NES if you prefer, only has one background layer. So how is this happening? It's done by changing the priority of the sprite on the fly. When interacting with background tile maps, sprites have two priorities, which we'll call high and low priority. You can also think of it as foreground and background priority. When they have high priority, they will appear on top of backgrounds, and when they have low priority, they'll appear behind them. The sprite priority system is a bit more complex than that when they are interacting with other sprites, as it needs to determine which sprites appear in front of or behind others, but for backgrounds, this is how it works, and that's all we really care about in this case. For those interested in this type of thing, it's specifically bit 5 of the sprite's attribute byte that's set to 0 or 1. What the game is doing here is changing the sprite tiles on the fly as the player or enemies pass by certain background tiles to toggle them to low priority. As the sprites are made up of a couple of columns of sprite tiles, they can progressively change each column one at a time to make it look like they are only half obscured and sell the illusion more convincingly. Next, we're moving over to the PC Engine, as AJ-Sing4545 wants me to uncover the mystery of the water effect in Akumaju Dracula X Chino Rondo, known as Castlevania Rondo of Blood in English. They want to know how your character gradually turns blue when going in water. Let's wade through the tides to have a look at this. So you've no doubt heard of Rondo of Blood, and I talked about some of the tricks this game used in my video covering the TurboGrafx 16, or PC Engine as it was called in Japan. And this game, which also used the CD format, unfortunately stayed Japanese exclusive on the platform. It was eventually released in English in 2018 in the Castlevania Requiem collection. It's considered one of the best classic Castlevania games, and many of you might even rank it as the number 1. In a few levels, there's some shallow water that you can walk through, and when you do, the parts of Richter's sprite that are underneath the water turn blue. If he happens to fall in the water in the deeper portions, his entire body turns blue as he sinks. It's a pretty neat trick in the game that's full of cool effects, but it's also quite subtle and easy to miss, especially since these parts where it happens are so brief. Those of you who are cluey about this type of thing, and I know many of you are, might be thinking that this must be a scanline interrupt that's changing the colour palette partway down the screen, like how Castlevania Bloodlines on the Mega Drive does it. Well, you'd be half right if that's what you were thinking. While it is using a scanline interrupt, it's not using it in the way you might expect, because it's not changing the colour palette of the whole screen. That blue tint to the background from the water is actually just part of the tile map, and you can see the enemies that jump out of the water don't change colour as they pass the waterline, they just swap their palette when they reach the ground. Instead, it's only changing Richter's colour palette. Richter actually has a completely blue version of his sprite, which you can see if we refresh the image on scanline 212 instead of on scanline 0, as this is a scanline where the interrupt occurs in this case. So what the game's doing here is changing Richter's sprite tiles to the blue version when he passes over this scanline. It's a pretty neat little detail that they really didn't need to do, but they did it anyway. The effect is enhanced by adding a flicker on the sprite layer after this scanline too, which you can see in this captured footage, helping to make the water look translucent. And yeah, in case you're wondering, they took the time to do the same thing for Maria too. Konami were really masters of their craft back then. The next question is from Yukaya, which sends us to the Game Boy Color. They say Toy Story Racer for the GBC looks amazing, with a very convincing and surprisingly detailed 3D environment. They'll love to see a breakdown of what graphical tricks the game is using to achieve all of that. Alright, let's go to Infinity and Beyond to solve this one. Toy Story Racer was released on the PlayStation 1 and the Game Boy Color, which is kind of an odd combination of platforms, but the question is specifically asking about the GBC version, which looks like this. As you race around the tracks, it looks quite impressive, like they are somehow managing to get the GBC to render lots of large polygons in real time. Of course, that is not what is actually going on, as the GBC can't do that. What the developers TierTex have done with this is that they have created these tracks in separate 3D software, then rendered them out as 2D images frame by frame so they can be played back as an animated background, almost like a video. You will notice you can't actually deviate from the track at all, it always follows a set path. All it does is speed up and slow down to match the player's speed. As the GBC was a tile-based system, it's been split up into tiles and is all drawn to the background layer. In what might have been a strategic move to increase the frame rate of the tracks, there's two scanline interrupts to split the screen and draw a different, much simpler tile map. There's one on scanline 15 to display the HUD at the top, and another on scanline 121 to draw the HUD at the bottom. The racers and the various pickups and obstacles on the track are the only sprites the game seems to be using, and they are just placed on top of the pre-rendered animated background. The commenter that submitted this question said that they had read it was doing something like this, and had a follow-up question asking if GBC cartridges even had enough space for this kind of thing. Well, the answer is yes. This particular game is 2 MB or 16 megabits in size, which is about average for a GBC exclusive game. It does this with the help of the MBC5 mapper chip, and if you want to know all about how those worked, I have a whole video about it that you can check out. Let's move over to the Mega Drive now and take a look at Alien Soldier, as there's been a couple of questions about this one. The first comes from Sticks and Stones 32, who asks, what about the butterfly boss in the game? Its wings are one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen on the console. I'm sure there won't be any kind of butterfly effect from examining this one, so let's do it. Alien Soldier was made by Treasure, a studio that had a habit of really pushing Sega's hardware to its limit to make incredible looking games, and we've studied some effects in a number of their other games throughout this video series. Alien Soldier is somewhat unique in that it only received a physical release in Japan and PAL territories, with the only official release in North America being on the Sega channel. It has at least appeared on various services like the Virtual Console and Switch Online since then, as well as being included on the Mega Drive Mini too. The game has Treasure's trademark incredible visuals throughout, but the question is specifically asking about the wings on this butterfly boss and how they are animated to do that. It should be noted that the game is only drawing one of its wings here, the one closest to the camera, leaving you to assume the one on the other side is mirroring its movements. While the body of the butterfly is a sprite, its wings are actually on a background layer, and the tile map consists of the wing in the up position and the wing in the down position. With that information, some of you may have worked out what's going on. This animation is achieved using raster effects to vertically compress and stretch this background layer, switching between the up and down positions after each vertical compression. In addition to that, as you can see, the palette is cycling between bright and dark colouring, making the effect more convincing. The other question is from TDRR Games, who is referring to Super Metroid's power bomb effect that I covered in a previous video, but notes that Alien Soldier has an extremely similar effect when some bosses die. So how did they do that on the Mega Drive that didn't have the window mask capabilities of the Super Nintendo? Let's see if we can defuse this one. So here's the effect when you defeat some of the bosses. It very much looks like the power bomb effect from Super Metroid, as it's a semi-transparent oval shape that extends out to fill the whole screen. This is another raster effect. One of the background layers changed to be a single colour with dithering on it in kind of a weird shape, but raster effects are applied to it to vertically stretch it out into more of an oval shape as it extends outwards. The dithering makes it appear to be translucent. It cycles through a few different colours from white to yellow to orange to red to complete the effect. Staying with the Mega Drive, Namco003 asks, can I look at Target Earth? In the opening sequence, you can control the scaling and rotation of the company logo. Knowing that the Genesis didn't have scaling capabilities, they've always wondered how they pulled the effect off. No logo is too large or small for us, so let's check it out. So, Target Earth, known as Assault Suit Leinos in Japan, was the first game in the Assault Suit series, and if you haven't heard of this one, you might have heard of the second game in the series, Cybernator, known as Assault Suits Vulcan in Japan, which released on the Super Nintendo and was actually a prequel. For this question, we're not looking at the game itself though, we're looking at a little Easter egg the developers added to the intro sequence, and specifically the logo of the Japanese publisher, Masaya. Normally it appears with a rotation and scaling effect on it already, but by holding a specific button combination, you can manipulate the logo yourself. Now it was a bit difficult to track down what the combination was. The question said they thought it was holding A, B and C at the Sega logo, then pressing start, but that didn't work. Most sources I found stated that you needed to hold A plus C plus either left or right on the second controller, but this didn't work at all for me either. I eventually tracked down the Japanese magazine that revealed it, called Beep Mega Drive from July 1990, and by using Google Translate on the specific paragraph about it, I found that you actually need to hold the diagonal up and right while holding A plus C on the second controller. So once again, if you want to try this yourself, on the Play 2 controller, after the Sega logo, hold up and right on the D-pad while holding A and C, and this should trigger it. The scaling and rotation of this logo, regardless of whether the player is controlling it, is done the same way, and it's a form of software scaling. It's very similar to the way Thunder Force 3 did it, a game I covered a while back, doing the calculation in code and updating the tiles in VRAM accordingly. As the image gets larger, it needs to do more and more calculations, and it gets slower and slower to update. What's actually interesting is that if the image gets too large, a corrupted version of the Sega logo starts appearing on the screen as well. I'm not 100% sure why this happens, but my best guess is that the game is getting confused about which tiles to draw once the image reaches a certain size, because the way the tiles that make up the Sega logo are stored in VRAM, they are very close to those that make up the Masaya logo. So I think once the image gets large enough, it's looking for the tiles it needs to complete it, and it's finding the Sega logo tiles instead. That's just a guess though, feel free to leave a comment if you have another theory. We'll stick with the Mega Drive as the next couple of questions are about Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Firstly, DDR Males asks, is there sprite scaling in the Marble Garden Zone Act 2 boss fight? Let's roll on down to find out. This is the boss fight at the end of Act 2. It takes place in the air as Robotnik is in the flying machine, and Tails needs to carry Sonic high enough so Sonic can jump at Robotnik to hit him without being hit himself. Robotnik alternates between flying close enough to be hit, with his drill and jets in different orientations, and flying off into the background. When he does the latter, he gets smaller. Is that sprite scaling? Well, the short answer is yes, it actually is. This isn't being faked by swapping in different sizes. This is a form of software scaling, gradually making his sprite smaller as he flies away, which is way easier to do than making it bigger. It looks like a pre-baked animation, and he moves in different arc shapes to complete the effect. From studying it, it looks very similar to the technique Factor 5 used in Mega Turrican that we looked at in the previous video. It's able to do this pretty seamlessly, as aside from the background scrolling in a number of different segments so it can parallax, there isn't a whole lot else going on in this scene. There's a very few sprites, and the foreground plane or plane A isn't actually being used at all. Secondly, two comments from VMan2K and JustJohn43 ask about how the 3D-like parallaxing water surface is done in the Hydro City and Launch Base zones. I don't think anybody actually likes playing these water levels in the Sonic games, since they deliberately slow you down when you're meant to be going fast, but let's dive in anyway to have a look at this. So here's the effect that the questions are asking about. The water's surface has this 3D kind of effect on it depending on your height relative to it, not just above the waterline but below it as well. This is a really clever implementation of parallax scrolling, but it's scrolling vertically rather than horizontally. We can see the relevant background plane, in this case plane B, specifically set up to be able to animate the water's surface like this. This isn't a raster effect that's compressing and stretching it like we've seen in previous examples, but actually an animation that happens when the tile map is vertically scrolled. There is still a raster effect happening though on the scan line where the water's surface is, to change the colour palette. In addition to that, there's line scrolling on just that surface portion if you move left or right, making it look like the water extends into the background. In the Hydro City levels, there's also a line of flickering sprites used on top of the scan line where the palette swap occurs to look like waves, which you can see a bit more clearly if you slow the game down a bit. Essentially, this is a very similar effect we see in some other games, like Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3 on the Super Nintendo. Although in the case of those, the colour change below the water surface is done using the Super Nintendo's colour math circuit to create a transparency effect, rather than doing a simple palette swap. That's a good segue into the last few questions we'll tackle in this video, as they are about some Super Nintendo games, the first of which is Jurassic Park. The Rex Terror is wondering how they made the Wolfenstein-like FPS interiors work in the game. Hold on to your butts as we examine this. There were a lot of different versions of Jurassic Park games, as different platforms got completely unique experiences as they were made by different development teams under different publishers. I do personally have a soft spot for the SNES version. I think it's actually a pretty good game, having a semi-open world-like design for the exteriors, and of course the first-person interiors we're taking a look at. I did actually finish this on original hardware back in the day. So the question is asking about how these first-person interiors were done in the game, and your first thought might be that it's doing something similar to what Wolfenstein 3D did on the console, but it's actually not doing the same thing at all. I have a video all about exactly how Wolfenstein 3D worked, so I recommend you check that out if you want the whole picture. In a nutshell though, they converted the game from using a raycasting engine to a BSP engine, drew the image to the screen in a small window, then used Mode 7 to scale it up to twice the size. This resulted in the game looking kinda pixelated, but it had much better performance than the raycasting engine on the Super Nintendo hardware. Jurassic Park, on the other hand, actually does use a raycasting engine, and is also using Mode 7, but in a very different way, which oddly enough, doesn't use any of its scaling or rotation capabilities. Instead, it's taking advantage of the fact that a Mode 7 tile map is 128 by 128 tiles in size, and that it's one of the background modes that can actually utilize the maximum of 256 different colors on screen at once. If we take a look at the tiles themselves, we can see they look a little strange. In fact, they're just single solid colors, with a few that alternate for stuff like blinking lights. It's basically just a copy and paste of the color palettes into tiles. This is because each individual tile of the Mode 7 background is just one single color, and the image is constructed on the screen by just drawing the appropriately colored tiles. They're basically treating each tile in the Mode 7 tile map as a large pixel. It may not be immediately obvious, but if we overlay the tile grid over the image, we can see that each individual tile is indeed just a single color. There's no complex shapes or patterns, which cuts down on the amount of storage space needed and makes drawing each frame a little bit faster, as each tile they'd need is already loaded into VRAM and ready to go. Using this technique, they can draw all kinds of different shapes and can show those shapes at many different angles and sizes. It's also relatively easy to create different looking environments, which the game does pretty effectively. It's pretty clever.
Clever girl.
To further increase performance, the background image is only taking up a little over half the screen, from scanline 49 to 176, so the top and bottom 48 scanlines aren't being used. The goggles and the HUD info around them are all sprites that are overlaid over the top of the Mode 7 background image to cover this up a bit. Despite all of this, the game only manages to update the screen once every 8 frames, so it's only running at an average of 7.5 frames a second, which is just enough to be barely playable. You can see why John Carmack opted to go for a different approach with Wolfenstein 3D, as he didn't consider this kind of performance acceptable, but for this game, it probably works well enough. This next question was posted by Hamburgers140, who says they were playing Secret of Mana and were wondering how they handled the sprite ordering in this game and other Super Nintendo titles. No worries, I can explain all that. Let's reveal the secret of Mana. So earlier in the video, I explained how the Nintendo Entertainment System, which only had one background layer, had two priorities for sprites that affected how they interacted with backgrounds, essentially a low and high priority, which made them appear behind or in front of the background respectively. The Super Nintendo also had a priority system in place, but because it could have up to 4 background layers depending on the background graphics mode it was using, it needed to be a bit more complex. Firstly, sprites could have 4 different priorities that affected how they interacted with background layers, as well as each other, with 3 being the highest and 0 being the lowest. In addition to that, each background layer had its own independent priority bit, which could be set to either high or low. Each background mode behaves slightly differently too, because of the different number of available layers. I've adapted this table from the SNES Dev Wiki to give you a better understanding of how the sprite and background priorities interact with each other in each of the 8 background modes, including Mode 7's EXTBG submode. The 4 sprite priorities are indicated by S0 to S3, and the 2 priorities for each of the background layers are indicated by the layer number, then H or L. There's one quirk missing from this table at the moment, which I'll circle back to in a minute. A game like Secret of Mana uses Mode 1 most of the time, including in this scene, giving it 3 available background layers. In this case, Layer 1 is the ground and the grass, Layer 2 is the rocks, trees, bridge and water, and Layer 3 is actually just the status bars at the bottom. But as the question points out, you might notice that the sprites can go both behind and in front of the rocks, and they can also be on top of the bridge and water, despite those being on the same layer as the rocks and trees. In the case of these rocks, the top few tiles that make up their image are set to high priority, so the sprites appear behind them, while the bottom few tiles are set to low priority, so the sprites appear in front of them. This is also why the sprites appear on top of the bridge and water, because those are also set to low priority. In addition to that, the sprite tiles are actually changing their priorities on the fly too, deviating between priority 3 or priority 2 depending on whether they are in front of or behind high priority background tiles. You can see when they step into the long grass, for example, their feet get obscured by it. There's one more thing of interest to point out about this, something which you may not be aware of even if you're familiar with how this works. I mentioned that the status bar at the bottom is on layer 3, which should be the backmost layer in Mode 1, so why is it actually sitting on top of everything else? This is because in Mode 1, and only Mode 1, there's an extra priority bit that can be set for background layer 3, which moves that layer's high priority tiles from near the back to the very front, while the low priority tiles remain at the back. It's intended to be used for HUDs or status bars, which you would generally always want to be drawn as the topmost layer, which is exactly how Secret of Mana is using it here. Lastly, we're going to tackle Tales of Phantasia, the first game in Namco's Tales series, as Just Kidding has a question about the intro. They noticed that there is what appears to be a Mode 7 scrolling background that fades into a Mode 7 rotating and zooming screen. But that's impossible, so what's actually going on here? Let's descend from the sky and figure it out. Tales of Phantasia, along with Star Ocean, has the biggest ROM size for a commercial game on the platform, tipping the scales at 6 MB or 48 megabits. Like Star Ocean, it's full of amazing effects and details, and features a lot of voice acting, even a song with actual lyrics that plays during the attract mode. I do need to clarify though that unlike Star Ocean, it does not use any kind of enhancement chip, although it does need to use a special mode on the CPU that allows it to access more than 4 MB of ROM space. The effect the question is referring to is this, that happens after the opening credits roll. The cloudy background is mode 7 and it transitions from a perspective angle to a flat angle before it fades away, revealing another mode 7 background behind it of the landscape before it zooms in to complete the sequence. There's actually nothing too fancy going on with this. Before the fade out happens, the cloud mode 7 background, which is on the main screen, is replaced by large 64x64 sprites, and enough of them to fill the whole screen. The mode 7 background of the landscape is then placed behind the sprites on the subscreen, and colour addition is applied. The sprite colour palette gradually turns black during the transition to fade the sprites out, while the mode 7 landscape gradually fades in from black at the same time. That's it. It's pretty simple, but very effective. Unfortunately, like Star Ocean, Tales of Phantasia was never officially released outside of Japan on the Super Nintendo, but it has received a high quality fan translation patch so you can experience this amazing game for yourself. Alternatively, it was finally officially released in English on the Game Boy Advance in 2006. So, there's another stack of your questions answered about how classic games pulled off their graphical tricks. How did you go guessing all of those? Did you get them all right? Here's something with the Super Nintendo Jurassic Park game that I got stuck on back in the day. In order to finish the game, you need to complete all of the objectives, which the game does a reasonable job guiding you through, but you'll also need to collect all of these eggs scattered around the map. Pretty much all of them are out in the open, and you'll find them as you play, but there's one that's hidden away to the east of the helipad that you actually need to walk through trees to find, when this isn't required at any other point in the game. They just couldn't resist. They had to throw this in to sell more copies of Nintendo Power, probably. So if you ever play this game yourself, and you find yourself missing one egg, it's probably this one. Give me a thumbs up if you liked this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.